Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Donald Trump's tariff policies are starting to take shape. The president says they'll help make America prosperous again. But critics warn the measures could push up prices and cost Americans their jobs. US inflation has increased unexpectedly, raising the stakes for Trump's tariffs. Could that tie the US president's hands? And how will the Federal Reserve react if prices continue to rise? And Trump says the measures are aimed at leveling the playing field, but will they shatter the rules of the global trading system? And can the World Trade Organization take any action to prevent that? An eye for an eye, a tariff for a tariff, same exact amount. That's how Donald Trump billed reciprocal tariffs on other countries during his election campaign, and he's moved to implement them potentially as soon as April. The measures come on top of the tariffs imposed on China, Canada, Mexico, and on metal imports, and more are likely to come, including on cars and semiconductors. The president says that duties will price out imports in favor of domestic production and collect a lot of money to help reduce debt. But he's acknowledged that prices will rise, at least in the short term. Now, that could turn into a headache for Trump after inflation rose unexpectedly last month, and for the Federal Reserve as it navigates the tricky path forward for interest rates. Laura Khan reports.
If they charge us, we charge them. The words of US President Donald Trump, who said a team led by his nominee for Commerce Secretary will calculate reciprocal tariffs on countries worldwide. This means charging countries the same import taxes as they charge the US, the details of which will be delivered to the president by April.
This is going to be the thing that makes our country really prosperous again. And this is going to be what pays down to $36 trillion in debt.
This is all in addition to the tariffs already imposed on Canada, Mexico and China and steel and aluminium imports. But it has sparked condemnation across the globe, with experts warning that it's US citizens that will bear the cost.
An import tariff is indirectly a tax on the exports. Why? Because when intermediate goods are coming from other countries and you pay high tariffs for imported intermediate goods, the cost of producing products will go up. So it is indirectly, it will act as a tax on their export. So export competitiveness will go down.
Trump says the tariff system as it stands is unfair, as the US import taxes are lower than its trading partners. In 2023, it had an average external tariff of 3.3%. The UK's was 3.8%, the European Union 5%, Mexico 6.8%, while China charged more than twice of that of the US at 7.5%. The number shoots up with India at 17%. Trump says the tariffs will create more American jobs and that US consumer prices won't change. He says he'll mitigate any initial impact with measures like tax cuts, deregulation, and bringing down consumer costs. But in January, US inflation hit a 7-month high. And with prices continuing to rise, experts say it is unlikely the Federal Reserve will lower interest rates anytime soon, despite President Trump wanting it to do so.
I would tend to say that also the consumer confidence data imply that investors and consumers are getting a little bit nervous about just how bad inflation will be, how sticky will it be, and how the Fed will be slower to lower interest rates, which overall I think puts a damper on things.
There may be also cases where the US has to lower its charges on individual goods. New Zealand charges less on milk, for example, while the EU charges less for imported trucks. While it's certain that the process of changing all tariffs based on reciprocal charges will be complex, economists agree that it's uncertain how this will affect the average American. Laura Khan for Counting the Costs, Al Jazeera.
But are tariffs really inflationary? Let's take a look at what some economists are saying. Typically, tariffs are viewed as measures that lead to a one-off increase in prices. But remember, it's American companies that pay the tax on imports and they tend to pass along higher costs to consumers. If they do so, inflation goes up. Economists at Deutsche Bank say that the most likely scenario is that businesses could pass along nearly half of the extra cost in higher consumer prices on average. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston estimates that core inflation could rise by 2.2 percentage points if a 10% levy is imposed on imports from the rest of the world and tariffs on Chinese imports rose to as high as 60%. While the US-based nonpartisan Tax Foundation says that Trump's tariffs on Mexico, Canada and China, if implemented, would amount to an average tax increase of more than $800 per household in 2025. Now, industries and consumers in different countries face uncertainty over Trump's tariffs. To protect their citizens, nations could challenge the measures at the World Trade Organization, among other steps. But do Trump's reciprocal tariffs, as a general principle, violate WTO rules? Well, according to the trade body, member nations are allowed to impose tariffs on imports which can differ depending on the item being bought. So, for example, a nation can impose a 10% levy on rice imports and a 25% tariff on car imports, but they have to extend the same basic rate to all members. Egypt, for example, wouldn't be allowed to impose a 2% duty on wheat coming from Russia, but a 50% one on wheat coming from Ukraine. This is known as most favored nation principle. But when two nations sign a free trade agreement, they don't charge tariffs on goods passing between them, but do maintain tariffs on those coming from elsewhere. Let's bring in our panel of experts. From Los Angeles, we're joined by William Lee, chief economist at the Milken Institute. From Washington, D.C., we're joined by Will McBride, also chief economist at the Tax Foundation. And in Oxford, in the United Kingdom, Ian Golden, professor of globalization at Oxford University. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Let's start with you, William Lee. Are President Trump's tariffs inflationary? Are they ultimately going to push inflation higher?
You know, I think there's a lot of confusion between the definition of inflation and the rise in the price level. The definition of a tariff is, by definition, a rise in the price of imports because of any kind of tax that's being put on. Now, a one-time increase in the price level will raise prices by whatever the amount is, it goes up, but inflation is a continuous rise in the price level. So by definition, a tariff, a one-time application of a tariff will not raise inflation. For that year, for that moment, when the prices go up, yes, prices go up. But we see from the first imposition of the Trump tariffs, the rise in the actual inflation rate over 3 years is less than a quarter of a percentage point due to tariffs. So no, it does not raise inflation.
Will, what do you make of that? Inflation ultimately helped President Trump get elected. He promised to cut the cost of living for Americans. Could inflation, do you think, become something of a headache for President Trump? To what extent could inflation end up overshadowing Trump's second term?
Well, I agree fundamentally with that assessment from William there, that inflation is really a monetary phenomenon. We learned this from Milton Friedman years ago. And we can look at the recent history, again, what happened with the inflation surge during the pandemic had nothing to do with tariffs, right? It had everything to do with the overspending by several $1 trillion from the federal government. And that was explicitly unbacked by any proposed tax increases, but rather deficit financed and supported by Federal Reserve purchases of the debt. So that's where the inflation came from. But I do agree that there is a temporary adjustment in prices and some fluctuations that can occur as the tariffs are passed through to consumers and businesses that rely on those imports. But if nonetheless, there are certainly there is deficit pressures ongoing in the U.S. for sure. And there's a lot of uncertainty relating to policy dealing with deficits, a lot of uncertainty across the board on policies coming out of the Trump administration. The uncertainty, I think, could contribute to inflation over time. There's uncertainty about how the federal government will rein in its budgetary gaps. If there's not a concrete plan put in place very soon, I think that does contribute to inflation. So yes, that would be laid at the feet of President Trump, and certainly there would be come back to haunt him if he doesn't deal with it properly.
Ian, bear with me. I'll get to you in just a moment, but I just want to go back to William Lee in Los Angeles to get some reaction to what we just heard there.
Well, Ian's brought up a whole bunch of topics which I hope we will explore in our conversation. But getting back to inflation, a rise in the price of imported peanuts or whatever it is that we're importing, that will raise that price of peanuts. Or if it's aluminum and steel as used to manufacture cars, that will be put into the prices of all the subsequent manufacturing. But let's not forget, a rise in a tariff rate doesn't necessarily mean that the consumer pays all of it. The incidence of the tariff can also fall back on the exporter, because if a country wants to export and participate in selling into the United States marketplace, they may be willing to lower their prices just for the privilege of being able to sell a large share of their output into the U.S. market. So there are two places where prices can change, both on the exporter side and on the importer side. And there's a lot of room. And besides, people can also substitute. If manufacturers find that the price of aluminum is becoming extraordinarily high, they'll try to find other products, plastics and other material to substitute for aluminum. So it's not necessarily the case that we find all of these prices going up. I think most of the economists who talk about these price increases have made clear assumptions about how people don't really substitute the use of these products. And I think, the full analysis is a very complex one. It's very hard. And I think people underemphasize a huge amount of uncertainty in the rise of prices that is estimated by various economists and trade foundations.
Ian, where do you stand on this issue of tariffs? Are they a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, I think they're a very bad idea. And I also beg to differ with William and Will, who sound rather sanguine about the impact on U.S. consumers and prices. It is the case that over time, people might find substitutes. There might be manufacturing substitutes, but those things take a long time to work through the system. You don't suddenly start manufacturing your car or your peanut butter in a different way. It takes time. And so I think for at least the first few years after these tariffs are implemented, we will see inflationary increases. We will see it lead to higher prices. That's, I think, going to happen. At least half of the tariff is likely to go into higher prices. And over that time, there will not be much substitution. It's not only a monetary phenomena that obviously contributes, but it's also about the supply side. And certainly in COVID, it was also about the supply side, the closing of many factories, the difficulties of getting PP and other equipment that was needed. And the shipping backlogs. The real risk, of course, in tariffs is that it leads to tariff escalation. So you don't just get a one-off increase in tariff, as William is assuming, but you get you get a ratcheting up. Others engage in tariff increases, and then you enter a tit-for-tat escalation in tariffs. And that certainly would be inflationary. It would slow growth. It would lead to interest rates coming down much slower. And not only in the US would consumers suffer, would the US economy suffer, but of course, globally, this would have a very negative impact on global growth, and it would affect jobs and livelihoods around the world.
William, I'll come back to you and give you a right of a reply to that in just a moment. But first, let me find out what Will made of that.
I fully agree. The great risk of this tariff approach to resolving this or that issue that the Trump administration has tried to address, trade deficits or the value of the dollar, et cetera. There's a whole series of rationales that are kind of rotating, but at the end of the day, it's clear Trump himself just really likes the tariffs. But the great risk is a worldwide trade war, and there's certainly a lot of historical precedent for that. That's what happened 100 years ago in the U.S. And worldwide with the Great Depression. That was exacerbated by all accounts by a increase in tariffs in the U.S. and a retaliatory trade war at the very beginning of that bad episode in history. So we learned our lesson after that, and we began a long period of decades of reducing tariffs around the globe and really embracing free trade. and the benefits of trade. And so I fully agree. Going back to that, forgetting that history, repeating the mistakes of the past, and engaging in another trade war is very, very destructive and dangerous, and we don't know where it ends. But as for the impact on prices, I mean, yes, that could, if to the extent that tariffs continue to ratchet up in a back and forth retaliatory series of events, then yes, the prices step up with each retaliation. I agree with that, but there's of course an end to it. It's an unfortunate end of reduced economic growth, reduced trade, reduced standards of living. But I would not call it an inflationary phenomenon. That's just a terminology distinction there.
Okay. William, I saw you shaking your head and smiling there. What did you disagree with?
Well, I think it's all you've just seen a demonstration of the case where you scratch any economist and mention tariffs, and the first thing they all resort to is the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the 1930s, where reciprocal tariffs were put on, and or rather retaliatory tariffs were put on, and we had a massive drop in the amount of international trade, and it exacerbated but did not cause the global recession of the 1930s. Let's remember, President Trump is using tariffs as a policy tool for economic and non-economic policy goals. What President Trump has done with tariffs is to say, look, we want to talk about ways of improving the trade framework for the world. WTO and the multilateral trade agreements that have been put in place since the 30s have really not worked well in the 21st century, where we have intellectual property and differences in scale economies around the world. So let's talk and bring everybody to the table and talk about the type of issues that we need to level the playing field for trade. What we see instead is discussions of, oh, we're going to have retaliatory tariffs and have trade wars and have the end of the world as an almost certain outcome. I think we should recognize that President Trump is using tariffs as a way of bringing people to negotiate and negotiate seriously. And because it is such a powerful tool, it's used very judiciously. And I think the discussions this time, which differs from the Trump 1.0, where his focus was on bilateral deficits and trying to reduce those, he really has a wider agenda for using tariffs, which is to bring people to the bargaining table and say, look, let's settle things in an amicable way for both sides. And by definition, when you have negotiations, both sides will reach an agreement that makes both sides better off. So I think we're reaching for historical analogies that really are not applicable in this situation.
Ian, what do you make of that? Is Trump using reciprocal tariffs as a negotiating tool? Are his reciprocal tariffs a breach of WTO rules? Is the WTO even fit for purpose in 2025?
I think he's taking a sledgehammer to the system. It's not only on tariffs, of course, it's in different domains as well. And I think that predicting that is simply going to be a negotiation and everyone's going to be better off, I think is a heroic assumption, to say the least. I'm not sure US consumers will be better off, and I don't think people will be better off around the world. So if there's substance in what he's threatening, and there seems to be very high levels of tariffs, it will be extremely detrimental. I don't think others are going to simply back down if he threatens it. I think we are already seeing from a number of countries reciprocal tariffs being introduced. The WTO has been absolutely hamstrung by the US principally in recent years because it refused to, for example, appoint judges to the appellate court of the WTO. So the WTO partly built by the US, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs after the Second World War, transforming it into the WTO, very much a North Atlantic project because people saw the benefits of trade in the post-Second World War era. The undermining of it, ironically, has also been done with the US. It's not a good organization. It has many failures, but it's the best we have. And I think the answer to the problems that the WTA faces is not to close it down or to break all the rules or to not appoint judges to it, but to make it work. And of course, that will happen through negotiation. That will happen through the key shareholders, members of the WTO coming together, principally the US, Europe, China, and a couple of others, and making it work. But that's a very different approach to what we're seeing now, which is not within the WTO framework, which is often in breach of the WTO framework. So the WTO is the best we have. I think Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the WTO, is doing a fantastic job, but under impossible circumstances. And that's not her fault. That's because the members of the WTO don't want it to work.
Will, I'll get to you in just a second, but William, I can see, disagrees with what Ian was saying. What do you disagree with?
Well, I think the one thing that we should remember is that the difference between the President Trump's approach and President Biden's approach, which really has favored this multilateral approach of getting trade agreements together, is that getting everyone to the bargaining table and negotiating together in one large group is always difficult because there's always the tyranny of the minority, right? There's always that one or two countries, especially emerging markets like China, who hold out and prevent the agreement from being settled. And essentially you throw things out until you've reached this small little core that everyone agrees with. What President Trump is focused on in the first administration as well as now is the use of bilateral and regional agreements to try to reach bilateral deals. And by definition, a deal makes everybody better off because you can always, not make the deal, right? So of course you're going to settle for something. And by the use of bilateral agreements, you can reach agreements much more swiftly and target the agreement to the needs of the two trading partners or smaller group of trading partners, whether it's a regional agreement or not. The failure of WTO really shows up in the huge number of free trade agreements that have popped up because WTO doesn't handle the trade issues adequately for many trading partners. We have regional agreements, we have bilateral trade agreements. We have a world of distortions, and we should always remember that we're talking about adjusting things in a world where we already have distortions. Economists call this the theory of the second best. And it's not necessarily the case that when you add a tariff or reduce a tariff, you make things worse off or better off. One of the things that you have to remember is things are done in a complex fashion, and bilateral negotiations by definition are faster and are tailored to the needs of the trading partners. And that approach is I think, has helped President Trump reach a lot of agreements and really has forwarded the agenda of make not just America great, but make the world great again, because we are able to tailor supply chains, diversify supply chains, and reduce the kind of single sourcing vulnerabilities that was shown to be so devastating during COVID. So I think the notion of having this this imaginative world of everyone negotiating together in large groups in harmony is something that's never happened, and I think in the real world, the fast business approach of President Trump has been much more effective.
Will, I want to come back to inflation for just a moment. Even if inflation rises, as President Trump says it will, only in the short term, that could complicate matters for the Federal Reserve. Trump wants interest rates lower. How will the Fed respond, do you think, going forward? In its January meeting minutes, it said that Trump's policies may hinder the disinflation process, and it indicated its readiness to hold rates steady. Will President Trump continue to respect the Fed's independence if he doesn't get his way on lower interest rates?
Well, there's no predicting President Trump's behavior relating to the Federal Reserve exactly. I mean, he's prone to surprises and in this domain for sure. But we've seen these two primary characters, Chairman Powell and President Trump, interact years ago in President Trump's first term. And what we saw there was that Powell was very much in support of defending the independence of the institution, the Federal Reserve, against any sort of jawboning from President Trump, and including by raising rates in 2018, 2019, very much against President Trump's public admonitions. And so I think there's every indication that these two characters, their history indicates that they are when they disagree, the Federal Reserve will maintain its independence. The president will have to respect that, I think, okay, given our institutional framework in the U.S.
All right.
And of course, Chairman Powell is up for reappointment next year, and so that's another story. But until then, I believe Powell will continue defending the institution.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Well, we've got about a minute and a half left. I just want to get another answer from Ian. How dangerous a moment is this for the global economy, if you like? Can you see any path through which Trump's policies could actually promote better trade and global trade harmony?
No, I think this is extremely dangerous. We moved from a world where I think, saw win-win. We saw tremendous growth in the world since the Berlin Wall came down in the 1990s, the early 2000s. We saw great success, countries that were poor becoming richer. We saw the US economy doing very well out of it, out of cheaper consumer goods, out of investment, out of trade. And now we're moving into a world where the President of the United States seems to think we're not in a win-win world, but in a zero-sum world. In other words, if someone else is doing well, the US is going to do badly. And I think it's very misguided. I think the US depends on a healthy world, on a vibrant global economy, and on a global trading system that's vibrant. So I think there is a danger that we get into a very negative scenario. It hasn't happened yet, and that's why I think it's very important those counseling the President of the United States counsel him to try and preserve what has been a fantastically effective system, not only for the US, but for countries developing elsewhere. Of course, there are many things that need to be fixed. The institutions are very imperfect, but they're better than being destroyed.
We could continue this discussion, I'm sure, for at least an hour or so. Gentlemen, I'd love to give William and Will the right of a reply, but we're out of time. Many thanks indeed for being with us, all three of you, William Lee, Will McBride, and Ian Golden.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you heard in that discussion, I'm at @afinnegan on X. Try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC, or you can drop us a line. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.